Thank you, Paulina. Thank you for the invitation to this conference. My topic is Rapture at a distance, searching for Pathic-atmospheric aesthetics. My provocative starting point is that while aesthetics is the past, atmospheriology could be the future. If in fact aesthetics were only a philosophy of art, it could be a discipline that is no longer obvious. As a form of reflection, aesthetics peaked within the upper class culture of the 19th and early 20th centuries, wherein art acted as a surrogate of faith, metaphysics, and politics. Specifically, as a revelation of the absolute, Shelley, of the idea, Hegel, the manifestation of a truth irreducible to mere presence, Heidegger, and or anticipation of an eschatological utopian reality, Ernst Bloch, Theodor Adorno, and so forth. However, it undoubtedly lost its centrality later on. This decline wasn't so much in the sense of Hegel's famous obituary, according to which art would become something irreversibly past if compared to the unrepresentable divine spirit of Christianity. The importance of aesthetics rather waned with the decreasing influence of stylizing romantic creative forces, yielding to an increasingly superficial collective felt bodily German Leiblich disposition. However, this view is completely mistaken in relation to a different kind of aesthetics, which refers to Baumgarten's Aesthetica as Cognitio Sensitiva, or at least the English affect aesthetics of the 18th century. Thus, it proves to be a wide-ranging philosophy of perception, whose core is a non-gnostic but pathic approach to phenomenal reality, according to the thesis by Herbert Strauss. As aesthesiology, it even claims to be prima philosophia, going far beyond the ancillary role typically ascribed to it by analytical aesthetics and neuroaesthetics, and certainly being far more than a tool for hypertrophic and enthusiastic immersive media. By opposing the otherwise irreversible process of cerebration associated with Western rationalism, it strives to even out the imbalance inherent in the one-side project of modernity. Unlike standard aesthetic theory, this kind of aesthetic, this Pathic aesthetics, no longer considered as a critical judgment of art, but an aesthesiological reflection on ordinary perception, is entwined with the problems of the present. It is thus possible to revise my initial provocative claim by stating that it is merely traditional aesthetics that belongs to the past, whereas atmospheriological aesthetics, which with its latent possibilities, is only now beginning to be discerned in its full potential. If interpreted as atmospheriology and in the light of the so-called atmospheric term, aesthetics deals, on the one hand, with natural phenomena such as twilight, brightness, darkness, the seasons, wind, the weather, the hours of the day, the fog, the greatness and power of nature, the sublime in a certain sense, without its Kantian intellectual anthropocentric interpretation, and more artificial phenomena, such as the soundscape, the holy as luminous, the genius loci, the charisma of a leader, etc. On the other hand, this aesthetics has something to say about all those activities once stigmatized by elitist traditional aesthetics. Stage design, advertising, landscape planning, event organization, museum design, cosmetics, urban planning, fashion, political and institutional communication, the entertainment industry, emotional and multi-sensory loyalty-oriented marketing, interior design, etc. And which instead, as you know, Gerd Böhme, since 1995, has rightly described as aesthetic work, lying at the core of the widespread design and aesthetic economy characterizing the late capitalist aestheticization of everyday life. This way, atmospheric aesthetics aims to combine and develop the old need for aesthetics of production with an aesthetics of effect, virtuous aesthetic, in a new way, seeking a renewed sensitivity-based aesthetic education of humankind, also considering the concerns raised by the Lonsdorff critical theory of atmospheres. This kind of Pathic aesthetics fits perfectly into the so-called new phenomenology, a discipline developed by Hermann Schmitz. Its theoretical project, fully congruent with the multidisciplinary scientific interest in the emotional sphere, views philosophy as a reflection on involuntary vital experiences and how one feels in a certain space. Of course, a space that is lived, that is three-dimensional and non-geometrical. In both perspectives, new phenomenology and Pathic aesthetics, moreover, reject the millenary psychic introjection of affective states, which caused insurmountable difficulties in explaining how such an alleged internal world could acquire a reliable knowledge of the external world. Instead, they consider affective states as atmospheres, that is, as feelings external to the subject and often impervious to any amending projection by the subject. The predictable aesthetic consequence is then the need to investigate not so much the traditional categories of aesthetics, the beauty, the sublime, the artwork, etc., but rather the Pathic structure acting in any regional ontology, including the art, of course. Furthermore, it is necessary to abandon the intellectualistic dimension of critical judgment, usually focused on art, and develop a reflection on the potential of ordinary affective perception. Ordinary in the sense neither lab experimental nor simply constative perception. Pathic aesthetics views aesthetic experience as a holistic atmospheric impression aroused by the situation encountered in the life world, irreducible to the radical scientificization of experience, perhaps through technical apparatuses. This approach paves the way for a promising and deliberately naive project of an aesthetics from below, rather than from above, or one aesthetic that is not based on art, no more on art, but on emotional and felt bodily lively involvement. As a first impression, this involvement is freed, as far as possible, from the sensory and emotional narcosis imposed by perceptual habits. New phenomenology obviously avoids stigmatizing the emotional reception of art, the so-called pathetic fallacy, and underlines both the essential, not only ocular, presence of the felt body in German life, and the way that all phenomena happen prior to any inevitably ecological, epochal, and etiological explanation. Thus, it also amends the ordinary ontological repertoire of entities to include qualia and especially causal things, according to the notion by Hermann Schmitz of ad ingere. These are characterized by specific performative non-Gibsonian affordances, which invite the experiencer not so much to do, but to feel something. Importantly, as a fuzzy term used to describe a fuzzy phenomena, atmosphere seems too general, superficial, and often grossly reductive when hastily applied to the art world. A kind of double asymmetry should be emphasized here. Art is certainly more than an atmosphere, as it is too complex and socio-culturally stratified a phenomenon to be reduced to everyday atmospheric experience, but similarly, an atmosphere is more than art, as it is too ubiquitous an experience, often unrelated to human intervention, to be reduced to the numerous clauses of artworks and the critical discourse on them. To say the least, it is far from easy to unambiguously establish the relationship between art and atmosphere. There are many preliminary problems that would require independent investigation. For example, does focusing on the link between art and atmosphere mean dealing with the atmospheric feeling communicated by the artist, or with the kind of art that is highly capable of generating contextual and atmospheric critical discourse within the art world? Or does it mean focusing on the type of atmosphere intentionally or unintentionally evoked by the experience of art? Or should the emphasis be on how one approaches and perceives every work of art? Does it imply that preference should be given to art that makes use of properly atmospheric means, for example, non-thingly, intangible, almost entirely immaterial, aerial, gaseous, or impalpable media, or even virtual elements? Or should attention be directed to art whose historical style and poetics are more oriented toward expressing the emotional climate of its era? However, the atmospheric term, the recent adoption in the humanities of a paradigm that prioritizes affective emotional aspects over cognitive reflective ones, demands more than just a new and expanded aesthetical lexicon. It is worth going well beyond Schmidt's traditional conception of aesthetics as a philosophy of art and applying to aesthetic artistic experience what he specifically claims on dwelling. It's the garden, a tea house culture. In this sense, an artwork is a form of domestication and cultivation of atmosphere in a controllable space. Atmospheres being feelings that, whether natural or artificial, are felt as spread in our surroundings. These atmospheres can rarely be transformed at will, especially when they, in my taxonomy, I call prototypical, namely objective, external, unintentional atmospheres, antagonistic to the percipient state of mind, and indeed totally irreducible to their subjective associationist projective process and their attempts at resistance. Whether we fully indulge in feeling an atmosphere, whether we react to it critically or escape from it, even in a special sense, depending on our felt bodily disposition, atmospheres remain quasi-objective. They are capable of imbuing a situation with a chaotic and vague halo that, albeit irreducible to discrete or linguistic elements, in the case of art, forces the experiencer to assume a half-devotional distance and maintain their own composure or disposition, German Fassung. By culturally reworking the centripetal and felt bodily aggressiveness typical of intrusive spatial feelings, the atmospheres of artworks are somewhat akin to humbleness called for by a church, thus reproposing in a mitigated and controlled form the mysterium tremendum et fascinosum of the holy and the numinous, according to the famous thesis by Rudolf Otto, or at least the official decorum required by an institutional public occurrence. It follows that artistic forms really serve as bait to evoke and capture atmospheres that are otherwise refractory, if not destructive. Even if tamed, the power of such atmospheres yields an authority that is frankly irreducible to the psychogymnastic overly intellectualistic and disciplined dimension described by Kant as a disinterested free play of the faculties, intellect and imagination. Atmospheric perception in everyday life is obviously different from that found in the experience of art. Let me give a few examples. An atmosphere of severe sadness, for example, normally arouses a feeling of respect in others, while a euphoric atmosphere infects and draws in even the most reserved people. Instead, the centripetal atmosphere of shame generates anguish in those who are responsible for it, and even in those who are innocent spectators, as in the intriguing case I studied before of vicarious shame. Finally, the atmosphere of injustice demands a kind of direct or legal retaliation by those who suffer it. Regardless of the kind of atmosphere, this affecting authority acquires a mitigated and contemplative form in art, as in Rilke's famous injunction to change your life in archaic Torso of Apollo. An artwork's affordances, in fact, never reach the point of an entirely irrational and ruinous rapture. After all, not even the avant-garde metamorphosis of life into a total work of art, Gesamtkunstwerk, occurs without being artistically manageable. Even in the case, the regression to a primitive present that art sometimes arouses is nothing but a transitory phase of the unavoidable personal emancipation of the observer from the artwork, involving at least a semi-reflective distancing from the involving presence present. Just like other privileged affective experiences, first and foremost dwelling, art always requires that the experiencer can be influenced by surrounding atmospheric impressions and the meaningful things in which the atmosphere might be condensed. It also requires the ability to ask how one feels. This is the general meaning of Heidegger's Befindlichkeit, in the co-presence of the person and the situational space they inhabit, but without ever sinking into it to the point of complete subjugation. The balance, thus achieved, is the result of a fortunate felt-bodied alternation between the two guiding impulses of the felt-bodied dynamics proposed by Hermann Schmitz, contraction and expansion. That is the well-known state of my language, immersion and re-immersion, that characterizes every artistic cathartic condition. Atmospherically speaking, being aesthetically re-educated might mean being able to stay in the between, in the right way. This pathic zone, preliminary to any rigid differentiation between the subjective and the objective pole, is yet to receive adequate philosophical and aesthetical analysis. Probably is more focused in Far Eastern thought than in Western culture. This in-between, moreover, should also be explained from a felt bodily livish point of view, starting from the issue of how to deal with atmosphere with necessary competence on the operative creative as well as the receptive perceptive plane. According to this atmospheric competence, aesthetics can play two roles. First, can become a practice to learn how to expose oneself and how to suffer what happens. Be the fires. Especially in the case of unexpected events. In this way, Pathic aesthetics can also help show that usually everyday life is effectively related not with the I, with the ego, but a concept that has been pathologically overestimated by modernity, but with the me. Hence, the onto and chronological primacy of mineness, Meinheit. This me, or this to me, precedes any ecological solidification and can be said to be sovereign and adult rather than autonomous, without having to neurotically remove any negative thing that may happen to it. Secondly, atmospheric competence can become a critical strategy. In fact, even though only an expert in curated appearance can resist being completely overwhelmed by the atmospheres they experience, we can all learn, at least to an extent, how to avoid the most alienating and manipulative atmospheres and eventually manage to distance ourselves from them after, of course, the initial emotional involvement. Nevertheless, one must emphasize the importance of the ability to live with emotional and immediate involvement, especially against the prejudice of the full autonomy of the subject. Our paranoidally rationalistic culture often considers this involvement an occult and alienating mediation rather than an emancipatory opportunity. The experience of art as a safe spatial cultivation of atmosphere can significantly contribute to this Pathic emancipation. Such an experience must involve a serious feeling of devotion that resonates as a qualitatively specific interaction between contraction and expansion, as well as between personal repression and personal emancipation, following here Schmidt's systematic felt bodily economy, which he curiously does not apply to art. This experience cannot be reduced to aesthetic pleasure, which mistakenly believes it can compensate for the modern lack of rootedness in the world to arbitrary imaginative fictions, whose aim is generally and predominantly the production of a state of pleasure. The resulting unstable synthesis between primitive presence and unfolded presence reveals here its full atmospheric centrality, giving the personally emancipated experiencer the opportunity to live, quote Schmidt's, a rich, colorful abundance of tender and magnificent feelings, but on the other hand, to secure themselves against the possibility of being completely submerged in these feelings and being unreservedly exposed to their gripping and commanding power. End of quotation by Schmidt. The aesthetic affective involvement analogous to the feelings and ethical norms that Hermann Schmidt calls aesthetoid, as they, quotation, are binding through conditional seriousness, end of quotation, is thus a kind of happy middle ground. Through it, one can experience the full range of even competing atmospheric powers without ever being subordinated to them to the point of losing one's detachment and subjective self-awareness. This balance between emotional involvement and reflective distance helps to avoid the extremes of affective collapse, the loss of the personal dimension, and overly abstract distance, the loss of absolute subjectivity. Having said that art is the safe cultivation of atmospheres, one must wonder whether a work of art can generate them, or is merely the phenomenal occasion of their manifestation. It certainly evokes and embodies them, sometimes even controlling them, but does it do so just as any other object that attracts atmospheres and condenses atmospheres into itself? The uncertainty of the issue is partly removed as soon as one emphasizes what art, including contemporary provocatory art, has in common with the harmonious culture of feeling that can be summed up as feeling at home and is experienced when dwelling in a protected space. For Schmidt, unlike Böhme, who considers the existence of veritable atmospheric generators, only in places like gardens, churches, tea houses, and one's home can one intentionally produce these attenuated atmospheres. Whereas politicians, advertisers, interior designers, etc., can only manipulate feelings through impression, kind of propaganda. This difference can be easily explained through the neo-phenomenological principle that believing everything, including affective life, can be produced is just an illusion. This claim further implies that the erroneous dualistic model of communication and the equally mistaken idea that atmosphere can emanate from single things rather than occasionally condensing into them. For Schmitz, therefore, a deliberately created atmosphere is inauthentic. It is only a poster situation, placat situation. The contraction of a segmented situation into an impression that is into a situation that comes to light in its entirety in an instant. But why? Why? Schmitz thinks. After all, the contraction is an axiologically neutral process during which, to use the terminology of Gestalt theory, a figure detaches itself from its background through a specific affective coloring, or in other words, a leading impression condenses a broader meaning. And yet, according to Schmitz, when a current situation propagates into a state-like one, or to put it differently, an impressive situation manages to posterize a segmented one, engendering a dangerous poster situation that differs widely from the inherently innocent posterized situation. The impression technique always ends up being deceptive. However, this is a truth requirement in the sense of an indeterminate adequatio, which contradicts the often invoked phenomenological descriptivism. And this, after all, is sufficient for the first personal affective dimension postulated by new phenomenology. Briefly, for Schmitz, the deception created by poster situations should be mainly attributed to the impression technique used in the present age, which is fundamentally atomistic and lacks a real nous. Our era would be dominated by an ill-guided autistic attempt to conjure up state-like situation for essentially political, propagandistic, and or economic purposes. The criterion for the aesthetic culture in the original sense of cultivation of atmosphere, therefore, are A, one, its ability to generate situations that, even though conflictual, are seriously implanting and not ephemeral. Second, its ability to create situations with a wide margin of involuntariness, whose probably impersonal imprint cannot be reduced to the outpouring projecting into space of the private soul. And third, its ability to create situations by extracting certain elements from a whole that is already in the air, without aiming at specific manipulative emotional details and their systematic combination. Nevertheless, treating superficiality, transience, propagandistic commercial purposes, and the deliberate planning of atmospheric effects, all characteristic of the aestheticization of everyday life, as distortions, leaves some questions unanswered. For example, it does not explain, normative aspect, whether the atmospheres thus evoked are A, non-atmospheres, B, false atmospheres, or simply manipulated atmospheres. It's not the same thing. The criticism brought forward by Schmitz and others consists in claiming that planned situations cannot be called atmospheric in the proper sense, which, however, means denying the omnipresence of atmospheres posited elsewhere. It is perhaps better to simply concede, thereby overcoming the tension between phenomenological descriptivism and Schmitt's idiosyncratic cultural critical diagnosis that planned atmospheric situation produce an artificial atmosphericity or an atmosphere of alienness, provided that completely unatmospheric situations simply don't exist. Schmidt's theory is rightly suspicious towards the supposed omnipotence of practice and the populist hygiene of mood, according to the term by Otto Friedrich Bollner. It therefore tries not to confuse the philosophical and existential centrality of feelings with mere sentimentalism, thus protecting the transcendent, preposterizing, and non-projective dimension of true atmospheric feelings. Nevertheless, it lacks a normative reflection that could explain when and why an implanting situation is healthy or pathological. Aren't they perhaps also implanting the situation created by authoritarian regimes? Now, rather than further emphasizing this point, art as the cultivation of atmospheres, it is worth underlining the neo-phenomenological project of a bodily hermeneutics of art. This approach, the approach, relates to art and culture in general, understood as a lifestyle, according to the term by Eric Rotak. Not to a mental spiritual act of some technical innovation, but to a felt body established disposition that is potentially as collective as the atmospheric feelings it engenders. According to this perspective, the felt bodily disposition, not necessarily conscious and always historically changing, explains both the aesthetic experience of the perceiver and the evolution of artistic styles better than traditional intellectual and social history. The condition of possibility of this felt body hermeneutics, or ekphrasis if you prefer, lies in the fact that, far from being inner states, quotation by Schmidt, atmospheres of feeling are sensed in one's own felt body, but not as emanating from it, but as something that happens to it or surrounds it in a certain sense. Thanks to felt bodily communication, leibliche Kommunikation. They are also perceived in encountered objects comparable in this respect to other result things. End of quotation. The predictable objection of determinism seems to be partially averted by the specification that individuals always selectively stylize what is climatically and culturally already possible. In addition, the history of atmospheres does not seem to be subject to a law of uniformity, so that each gesture, whether artistic or not, is the result of specific combinations of felt bodily disposition among many possible ones, a sort of sight-like. This hypothesis has the merit, for me, of transforming beauty from a transcendent gift into a historically conditioned solution to the conflicts among a finite number of felt bodily variables. Although the predominance of a particular disposition within a style by no means excludes the significant role of subordinate dispositions. Unfortunately, it faces challenges both in explaining the differences in quality and the rank among different epochs and aesthetic objects, and in establishing the beginning and end of various stylistic periods. Still, this yet unexplored program is certainly worth pursuing if it remains free from the biases of individual taste, acknowledges the polyphonic nature of felt bodily disposition within the single age, and recognize that the disposition of a given epoch or culture can be deciphered and also find resonance in another epoch or culture. In conclusion, this talk aims at redefining the role of aesthetics and art within a phenomenology of involuntary life experiences. Critically considering too long. Okay. Redefining the role of aesthetics and art within the phenomenology of involuntary life experiences, this talk practically considers a traditional explanation of the relationship between atmosphere and works of art, and attempting to view aesthetic experience not as intentional creation, but as the engaging cultivation of powerful atmosphere from a distance and in a safe space. In addition, there is a particularly risky provocative thesis. This view posits that there are phenomenal commonalities between art and law, but especially when the latter is considered free from an affective formal positivism and divine and or natural axiology. But on this topic I cannot. To conclude, such aesthetics also aims at rehabilitating perceptual intelligence more generally. It seeks to view art as a qualitatively enhanced form of non-lab experiential perception that interacts with phenomena, people, things, qualia, and especially quasi-things, in a felt-bodied and even sporadic manner, indifferent to the reistic dogma that stigmatizes the ephemeral. Second, it addresses situations in which human beings cultivate atmospheric field in a protected space. The goal being not to control these feelings, fascinating authority, but to experience them from a distance, without the risk of facing the violence they exude in the real world. In addition to this, it should also train us to simply tune into these feelings and to critically develop the atmospheric, already spoken about that, competence that protects us from being manipulated. And finally, these aesthetics should especially focus on the felt bodily experience of resonance that shapes our being in the world. This resonance is a reaction to the power of atmospheric feelings, resulting in a balance between, on the one hand, personal regression into primitive presence, in other words, absolute subjectivity, and on the other hand, the personal emancipation needed to detach oneself from overly threatening affects. Quite obviously, a neo-phenomenological and Pathic aesthetics of this kind, as anti-intentionalist and anti-ecological as possible, is today only a work in progress. The emancipatory balance between the active autonomous subject and the Pathic sovereign subject may be for now just a regulative principle. However, this is not just a formal oath to be, as the aesthetoid norms deeply involve our experience even without relying on logical rules. They require cultivating atmospheric feelings from a distance, allowing us to enjoy their powers, which are, after all, what gives meaning and relevance to our existence, without making us only headless and manipulable passengers of atmosphere. Thank you.